In this unit, we're going to be taking a look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and a little bit about something called fiscal policy. And this is the first lecture in Unit 7, which is this unit on ADAS and fiscal policy. And I'm glad that you're here, because aggregate demand, aggregate supply is the basic fundamental model that we're going to use to study macroeconomics in this class. So it's good that you're here to take some notes. First, I've given you the definition of aggregate demand, but I think it's useful before we get into that to think about the word aggregate versus the word demand. And we learned that demand is just simply the willingness and ability to buy goods and services on a specific good or service. And aggregate means combined, right? Combined, or added all together. So if we add all of the demand together for all the goods and services that buyers in an economy are willing to purchase at all the different price levels, that is the demand for everything by everyone in the United States. Now this is a shorthand, right? That's not exactly correct, but generally we can say that all goods and services buyers are willing to purchase at all the different price levels is aggregate demand. Now aggregate demand is going to have a downward slope. So just like demand, we'd say it's going to have a downward slope. It'll look like that. And we'll label it AD. Now, we do need a couple of axis labels here, axes labels. And instead of price, we're going to use price level. And down here for output, we're going to use either GDP R for output, or we can say Y. Y is sometimes given as a value that's our variable that denotes output, or you could just write GDPR. Now, the downward slope of aggregate demand tells us there's an inverse relationship between the quantity of aggregate demand and the price levels. So in other words, right, we would say that if price level goes up, therefore, right, so we go from point A to point B on our graph, price level goes up, what happened to the aggregate demand? Well, the quantity of aggregate demand went down. Notice that the aggregate demand curve didn't change. Just as we say that price doesn't shift the curve, we would say price levels don't shift the curve. Don't shift AD, right? Price levels don't shift aggregate demand. Now, price levels do have an effect on this relationship. If we said price levels go up, the quantity demanded goes down. Now, there are three reasons why this happens, right? One of them is called the wealth or real balance effect. And this is the idea that if you move from A to B, price levels are getting higher, the purchasing power of the money in your wallet is going down because you can't buy as much stuff. And so households will decrease their quantity of consumption. Notice that this isn't decreasing the overall level of consumption, but they're decreasing the quantity because they're moving up this curve. It's a slide along the curve. The interest rate is another reason why this relationship happens. If the price level goes up, right, from A to B, price levels go up, then the lenders are going to charge higher nominal interest rates. And this nominal interest rate is a review from last unit, is the named interest rate. So the interest rate that's just named on the loan. When that happens, households and firms will decrease their borrowing in response to that higher cost of borrowing, and that'll decrease the quantity of consumption and the quantity of investment spending, because both of those are responsive to that interest rate. Now, this is the nominal rate. Later on, we're going to talk about the real rate. Now, the last reason why this relationship holds true, and just for reference, it works the opposite way as well, is that when price levels in a country go up, right, that foreigners would purchase less from that country because stuff is relatively more expensive. At the same time, people who live in that country would increase their purchases of things from other places, international places. So this would be a decrease in exports, right? That's what this means. And this is an increase in imports. And so we'd say that overall, the quantity of net exports goes down. And so that's what causes aggregate demand to go down like that. Now, aggregate demand is made up of four components: C plus I plus G plus XN. So last unit, when we learned how to calculate the spending approach to GDP, that was super helpful because this is the same components for aggregate demand. If we add together all of the spending in the economy, that's the idea of aggregate demand. So the shifters of aggregate demand are when these four things change, right? When changes in consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports happen. Now there's a few things that can cause these things to change. So for example, the first one for consumption, right, we can say is households' wealth or their income. And so we'd say that if households, for example, feel more wealthy or are more wealthy, that would increase their consumption spending. So that can be like if the stock market is doing really well, then people are wealthier, and so they would go out and increase their consumption spending. Another would be real interest rates. Real interest rates. Because if the real interest rates change, then that can change consumption and investment. If the real interest rate goes down, consumption and investment would rise. Now, what could cause that? That would be maybe the central bank changing that interest rate. So we'll talk in another unit about why, but the changes in the money supply is really what that is, the money supply. MS stands for money supply. Now, a third one, right, would be household expectations about the economy, about economic conditions, about the economy. So if we think that there's going to be a recession, then we probably are going to reduce our consumption spending. So if we expect a recession, C will go down. And then we're going to take a look here kind of and in terms of investment, right? Investment can be another one that we'll list here. And investment, we would say that for them, it's their expectations, firms' expectations about the economy. So their expectations matter about the economy. And we'd say real interest rates. Real interest rates. Real interest rates. And these are exactly the same as in that first one. I just realized I left one out here, right? So we've got one more for the consumption spending. Okay, one more. And that's going to be taxes and transfers. So let me explain that really quick here. Taxes and transfers. If we increase income taxes, well, that's less money that you have available to spend, so that would reduce consumption. Now, students will sometimes get confused. They'll say, oh, well, if taxes go up, then that's going to affect government spending. And I'd say, oh, no, not quite. The thing to think about in terms of government spending is that on the one hand, right, you got this hand over here, government, taking your money, and then you have this hand over here, and this is the spending hand. And the two hands don't talk to each other. If the government's going to increase taxes or decrease taxes, it doesn't change government spending. But the taxes can affect consumption spending. Likewise, transfers, which is the fancy name we give for things like welfare payments and Social Security payments, they don't affect government spending on goods and services. So we'll say government spending on goods and services only. On goods and services. So it is not taxes and transfers, right? Not taxes or transfers. So we would say that those things don't count directly in there. Now, they would have an effect, and this is maybe a useful little hair to split here. If I cut your taxes, the tax cut doesn't count as consumption spending. It's only when you take that money and you go spend it. So when we give grandma a transfer, Social Security payment, that doesn't count in aggregate demand. But when grandma goes and buys cat food with it, that increases consumption spending. Okay? Now we're going to switch back. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here. Investment spending. This can also be corporate taxes, right? Corporate taxes and subsidies. So we'd say if you specifically cut taxes on corporations, right, that can increase investment spending because they're going to have more money to spend on things and firms spend money. And if you subsidize them, right, that's the same idea, is that would increase investment spending. Now, that's to say, once again, the tax and the subsidy are not directly counted. It's only when they go and buy something with it or when they build something. So if we give a bunch of corporations a big tax cut and all they do is just buy back their stock to boost their stock values, that doesn't change anything with aggregate demand. So we have to be really careful when we talk about corporate taxes and subsidies. When we talk about cutting income taxes for folks and transfers, that if you want to really affect aggregate demand, you have to target investment spending. So maybe a tax credit to build that new factory. If you don't build the new factory, you don't get the tax credit. A subsidy to install solar panels. That way, you're not just giving money to the electric company. You're saying, hey, you get the money only if you do what we think is good in investment, right? Now, government spending, we said government spending on goods and services, that's the only one we have to know there. And the last one, there are two things that can cause changes in net exports. Now, I'm going to remind you, right? Net exports, we said up here, you've got this net exports effect. This is only because of price levels, right? Price levels. So all three of these are due to a price level change. So down here, we're going to say not because of price levels. Not because of price levels. If the price level changed, then we'd say it doesn't affect, right? It doesn't change net exports. Now, it can affect the quantity of net exports, but not the actual like underlying relationship. Two things can change net exports: exchange rates, which we're going to talk about later, and then the last one here is going to be trade partner economic conditions. And what do I mean by that? So we're going to put parentheses unit 10 here because we're going to come back to that. Trade partner economic conditions. This is the idea that if two countries trade with each other, Japan and the United States, and Japan enters a recession, the Japanese are not going to buy as many goods from the United States because Japan's in a recession. They can't afford it. So U.S. exports to Japan go down. So this one is the idea that if one country is a little bit sick, they're feeling unwell, right? Not in a literal sense, but their economy isn't feeling so well, then the other country might catch a cold as well. Okay, so we've taken care of some notes on aggregate demand. One last thing that before I forget is hopefully you remember, if we move the curve to the right, that's an increase. And if we move the curve, we'll say this one's aggregate demand 2 to the left is a decrease in aggregate demand, right? Different from movement along the curve. And price levels don't shift the curve. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.